Well, thank you very much to GRIPS and to Professor Goto for having me this afternoon. It's a great honor to be here in Tokyo. And I'm going to talk to you about competition policy in a global era, achievements and challenges, mostly basing myself on my long-standing experience as the head of the competition committee of OECD, and also some of my activities, previous activities, when I was for 7 years the head of the trade and competition group at the WTO. The topics I'm going to cover are numerous. There are 7 topics really. One of them has already been alluded to by Professor Goto, the proliferation of competition law throughout the world, which has led to a variety of questions, such as the differences between those different laws, their convergence, their complementarities between competition law and other policies or other laws, the advocacy function of competition authorities, the dysfunctions between a fragmented legal order and an increasingly globalized market, achievements of regional cooperation, possibility of multilateral responses, and I will conclude on how this is relevant to the work that the OECD is contemplating. Now, most of you know what I mean by competition law, but for those of you who are not specialists, I will just very briefly mention the fact that in market economies, there is always the risk that competition on the market, which is the source of the expected benefits from market economies, is not going to prevail, is going to disappear, either because there are going to be anti-competitive practices undertaken by some of the players, or there are going to be anti-competitive transactions, such as mergers, which are going to eliminate the competitors, or sometimes there is going to be state intervention, which is through regulation, make it very difficult for competition to remain. For, I would say, now 200 years, for 200 years, economists have had this notion that if you are in a market economy, and if competition prevails, I mean, I'm simplifying really the economic theory, but if competition prevails, then the economy will be efficient in the sense that it will allocate the scarce resources of the economy to the best possible use, and therefore the welfare of consumers will be maximized. There will be maximum global satisfaction given the technologies and given the scarce resources of the country. So the idea there is that competition is a tool to manage well the economies, at least the market economies. An interesting aspect, of course, is the fact that this tool has been translated into laws into many countries. And as a matter of fact, I'm not aware of any other law which is legal law which is directly derived from an economic theory rather than from a set of values. But competition laws are there to prevent anti-competitive practices or anti-competitive transactions or anti-competitive encroachment by public bodies on the market, and they are directly derived from this line of thought which I've mentioned among economists. Now let me turn to proliferation. Professor Goto already mentioned some of this in taking a broad view starting from the early 1900s. I'm just going to concentrate on a much more recent period, which is since the beginning of the 1990s. And between 1999 and 1998, and 2008, to take just one section, more than 60 countries have adopted a competition law. 60 countries which did not have a competition law before 1998. And you can see from this list here that there are a lot of developing countries, but not only developing countries, which have adopted such a law. Now, today we have roughly 120 countries in the world that have a competition law. These changes, I would say, every 6 months. We have additional countries that have competition law. If I had given this speech about 10 years ago, I would have said there are 50 to 60 countries in the world that have a competition law. So really, there's been proliferation of the law very rapidly, concentrated towards the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s. A second phenomenon which is worth reflecting on, and I will mention it later, is that 63 other countries had a competition law, but have chosen to upgrade their competition law during the same period of time, which means that we see constant changes in competition laws in many countries. And those changes are typically quite important, and we will see that why those changes happen. And it's largely through cooperation, the dissemination of best practices, and I would say the advance in the technology of antitrust enforcement. But clearly what this says is that there has been a concern about competition and a desire to eliminate anti-competitive practices, which has been very present in the world over the last 10 to 15 years. And of course, this has gone together with different things which have happened in the global economy. One of them has been trade liberalization and the rapid increase in international trade, particularly in the 1990s, following a succession of trade rounds. And a globalization, I mean, I don't know whether globalization is always the word that one would want to use, but let's say an internationalization of the economies, which has been made possible both by those two movements. Why is there a link, by the way, between the trade and the competition dimension? I think it's quite clear that when you enter into a movement of trade liberalization with another country, what you're saying is really, I will accept the products or the services of this other country more freely by eliminating some custom duties or some border barriers, which are usually governmental barriers. And I'm willing to do this in the hope that my firms will be able to export more in this other country. But I want the deal to be fair and effective, and I don't want to open my borders unless I have some reassurance that business people in the other country are not going to put up obstacles that are going to prevent, in fact, my exports from reaching this other country. And that's why in many trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, but also regional trade agreements, we have clauses or provisions that say, well, you know, we're not going to use our anti-dumping instruments against you anymore, but as a quid pro quo, we would like you to have a competition law so that if there are some obstacles put up by the business community in your country to my exports, there is a place where I can go and complain, and those complaints can be treated. Now, what goes with proliferation, of course, of laws is a diversity of laws, because laws, like any political act, is the result of a compromise, not only political compromise, but compromise between various values of various goals in societies, and there is no reason why societies should all be the same. And when we look at competition law, we see that they are different in a number of dimensions, in the scope that they have, in the goals that they have, in the substance that they have, in the enforcement priorities, which are chosen and sometimes written into the law, but often chosen by the competition authorities, in the instruments that they use, in the analysis of competition that they use, in the kind of remedies that they favor, and, of course, in the procedures that they follow. And those differences, where do they come from? Well, they can come from a number of origins. History may be one. A good example of this would be when the Eastern European countries moved from a command economy to a market economy. They had a long tradition of government intervention into market mechanism, but also of important state-owned enterprises being the leaders. So there was a serious worry with possible abuse of dominance. If you're going to privatize all those firms, they are going to have a very large market share, and they may have excessive pricing, and therefore excessive pricing, which was never much of a concern in the U.S., was much more of a concern in Central Europe or in a number of developing countries. There are also political beliefs. One of the differences, let's say, between the French competition law and the German competition law, or the competition law, the German competition law and the U.S. competition law, has to do with the fact that before the Second World War in Germany, there were very powerful business lobbies. Those business lobbies were more or less pushing for a rather aggressive foreign policy, because this was good for the economy, because it made a need for a bigger army, a need for more tanks, and therefore more steel being produced, and so on and so forth. And in a country like Germany, you do have a feeling that besides the technicalities, I would say, of competition law enforcement, big business is bad in itself, because it can pervert the political system. In the U.S., on the contrary, you start from a country where there is a spirit of entrepreneurship, a spirit of economic freedom, and where bigness is the reward for good performances, in principle. So there is none of this reticence vis-à-vis big businesses. If you're big, presumably it's because you've been better than your competitors, and that is something which is supposed to be for the good of the economy. In Europe, if you're big, there's always a question about whether you're too big, and of course some of that came back, surfaced again in the financial crisis. But what I just want to say here is that history has something to do, clearly, with the way competition laws are going to be written and the spirit of those competition laws. And of course, the economic analysis, which is going to be at least implicit in the law, very implicit, because usually legislators are not economists, and they don't have a complete vision of where the economic analysis should be in those cases. But depending on whether they are concerned about fairness, or they are concerned about efficiency or productivity of the country, you're going to have different styles of competition laws and different standards which are going to be used. The level of economic development is going to make a big difference. First of all, in many developing countries, you have a large number of very small firms, or sometimes a large informal sector, which is very difficult to handle with any kind of law, but in particular with the competition law. You may have a judiciary which is not so well versed in economic analysis, and maybe not so independent, and therefore you may want to have simpler rules that are per se rules that are easier to implement, even if economic analysis would suggest that you should be more sophisticated. At the first level, it's debatable whether you want to have terribly complicated laws, that are not complicated, but sophisticated analysis, which is going to require a lot of resources on the part of the competition authority and a lot of resources on the part of business to arrive at a better decision. But there's a question of trade-off, cost versus efficiency. In countries that have been beset by difficult circumstances, such as, let's say, South Africa, for example, clearly there is a dual concern. One of them is with poverty alleviation, and the other one is also to allow, in the new order of things, the black community to develop and prosper, which it was not easily, could not easily do previously, because of apartheid and a regime of exploitation, and which was basically based on races. So, for example,